we often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bond. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us? What could be more alien to the universal aspirations of our peoples than war and the threat of war?
I never knew hustlers confessed in stereo.
All these masons serve the evil eye. They all want to put their fingers in the pie. But Adonai comes down to the sky and they gonna die. Alright. Can't help it sometimes. Can't help it sometimes. Sorry. Let's see here. I'll make sure I have certain things up. Here is part 6 now. Let me just put a couple here. Oh, I think I'm going to play this one. Okay. Just getting them ready for the end of this here. And I'll play. Okay, that's perfect. That's perfect. I'm going to put the little squawk box up here. There we go. So we left off on now page number 175 at the 3-minute and 33 mark. Oh no. So Mr. Hitta continues. They lacked a number of requisites without which such a task could never be successfully undertaken. And that is, the bourgeois national group could not make good the damage that had been done. That's what he's referring to. Even if they had the best intentions, they lacked a number of requisites without which such a task could never be successfully undertaken. The years that followed have justified the opinions which were held at the time. In our small circle, we discussed the project of forming a new party. The leading ideals which we then proposed were the same as those which we carried into effect afterwards. When the German Labor Party was founded, the name of the new movement was to be founded, should be such that of itself it would appeal to the mass of the people, for all our efforts would turn out vain and useless if this condition were lacking. And that was the reason why we chose the name Social Revolutionary Party, particularly because the social principles of our new organization were indeed revolutionary. So they do this all the time. It's just identity politics. That's all it is. It's identity politics. It never brings anybody together. And this man lies, acting like Germany was ever heterogeneous, which it wasn't. Germany is about as heterogeneous as America, which means it's not, okay? But he continues, but there was also a more fundamental reason. The attention which I had given to economic problems during my earlier years was more or less confined to considerations arising directly out of the social problem. Subsequently, this outlook broadened as I came to study the German policy of the Triple Alliance. This policy was very largely the result of an erroneous valuation of the economic situation, together with a confused notion as to the basis on which the future substance of the German people could be guaranteed. All these ideas were based on the principle that capital is exclusively the product of labor, and that, just like labor, it was subject to all the factors which can hinder or promote human activity. Hence, from the national standpoint, the significance of capital depended on the greatness and freedom and power of the state, that is to say, of the nation, and that it is this dependence alone which leads capital to promote the interests of the state and the nation from the instinct of self-preservation and for the sake of its own development. So if you notice throughout history, these different countries kind of go through the same thing that happened in the Exodus. So there were times when Pharaoh said, I will let them go, but then changed his mind. That's hypocrisy. It's lawlessness. There were times when he tried to make new terms, which like, oh, only the men go. The women and children stay here. It's like, no, we all have to go. So this is what it is, where he's talking about the freedom and power of the state. These pharaohs, which includes him, that's why he took on the name Führer. That's literally Pharaoh. It's literally just how far they'll let them go. And they always go back on their words, and they're always hard in their hearts. And because of what they worship and what they pay honor to, sometimes God hardens their hearts because they deserve it. They've already made their decision. So he plays with them as with a bird. Puts them on a leash. Shows them to the girls. So, I'm quoting scripture, by the way. I read the book of Job. Self-preservation. Okay. He continues, on such principles, the attitude of the state towards capital would be comparatively simple and clear. Its only object would be to make sure that capital remained subservient to the state and did not allocate to itself the right to dominate national interest. Oh, and remember, I forgot to say, labor isn't the only thing that makes capital. Mines and investments, how you invest things, there's certain intermediaries. So this man's saying there's no mediator. There's only workers and only the force that tells them what to do. It's like, no, there's a mediator that makes more money than all of them and has more authority than all of them. And instead of working with them or accepting them as part of the society, they treat them with contempt. He continues, thus it could confine its activities within the two following limits. On the one side, to assure a vital and independent system of national economy, and on the other, to safeguard the social rights of the workers. Previously, I did not recognize with adequate clearness the difference between capital, which is purely the product of creative labor, and the existence and nature of capital, which is exclusively the result of financial speculation. Here, I needed an impulse to set my mind thinking in this direction, but that impulse had hitherto been lacking. The requisite impulse now came from one of the men who delivered lectures in the course I have already mentioned. This was Gottfried Feder. Or that's kind of like Fyodor. It's with an F. Fyodor. It's Fedor. It's Peder. It's the mouth invokes or has a character of the city. And remember, city in Hebrew, is to strip away and make bare, and also to terrify, excite, as in relation to negative, which that's why it's usually terror. Because Hebrews knew what happened in the city. That's why their word for city is very negative. Remember, city in Greek was polis, police. So police literally just mean a city. It's like, what city? Is this like a breakaway government? What's going on here? Read up on breakaway governments and breakaway civilizations, by the way. They always plan one. He continues, the requisite impulse now came from one of the men who delivered lectures in the course I have already mentioned, Gottfried Feder. So Gottfried is literally God is freed, in German at least. And the mouth of the character of the city. That's a very interesting name. Because I Hebratize the last name, but the first name in German means God has freed. For the first time, he says, in my life, I heard a discussion which dealt with the principles of stock exchange capital and capital which was used for loan activities. After hearing the first lecture delivered by Feder, the idea immediately came into my head that I had now found a way to one of the most essential prerequisites for the founding of a new party, he says on page 176 on the 12-minute mark. Let's see here. To my mind, Feder's merit consisted in the ruthless and trenchant way in which he described the double character of the capital engaged in stock exchange and loan transaction, laying bare the fact that this capital is ever and always dependent on the payment of interest. In fundamental questions, his statements were so full of common sense. Remember, whatever that means. Sense is not common. And what is sense? That those who criticize him did not deny that au fond his ideas were sound, but they doubted whether it be possible to put these ideas into practice. To me, this seemed the strongest point in Feder's teaching, though others considered it a weak point. Oh, and if you're wondering why my voice is a lot calmer and more subdued these last 2 episodes, I worked out this morning and I did some spiritual warfare, so I have a lot of shalom. Just in case anybody notices. Some people notice that stuff. I appreciate those people. So let me read that again. He says, it is not the business of him who lays down a theoretical program to explain the various ways in which something can be put into practice. His task is to deal with the problem as such, and therefore he has to look to the end rather than the means. That's very American of him to say, by the way. The important question is whether, that's why it's interesting in the video when I show you, it's the Arc of Washington with the Twin Towers. On one side, you have Washington chained to something on his foot, and he has a book opened, and it says Exitus Acta Probat, which is the end justifies the means. They said that for crucifying Messiah, by the way. And they crucified him because he said, I am the chosen one. Yet, Trump looks at the sky and says he's the chosen one, and you hear nothing. You could look that up, by the way. Just look up Trump, chosen one, and it'll pop up. He says, the important question is whether an idea is fundamentally right or not. The question of whether or not it may be difficult to carry it out in practice is quite another matter. When a man whose task is to lay down the principles of a program or policy begins to bury himself with the question as to whether it is expedient and practical instead of confining himself to the statement of the absolute truth, his work will cease to be a guiding star to those who are looking about for light and leading, and will become merely a recipe for everyday life. It's interesting how he uses the word absolute truth, even though he talks about things like fate and destiny, and most of his words are very godless. Somehow he still utters the phrase absolute truth. But anyway, he continues, The man who lays down the program of a movement must consider only the goal. It is for the political leader to point out the way in which the goal may be reached. This is why in Scripture, in the Gospel and in the letters, they emphasize spiritual means and not physical. Because the goal is spiritual, so the means are spiritual. The end is spiritual, so the means are spiritual, not physical. Not weapons that are physical, but weapons that are spiritual. He continues here, the thought of the former will, therefore, be determined by those truths that are everlasting, whereas the activity of the latter must always be guided by taking practical account of the circumstances under which those truths have to be carried into effect. If you feel like some of the things I say sound odd, I'm following the punctuation that it puts in here, and sometimes there are typos, it seems, so I'm reading it exactly how I see it. Mr. Hittite continues, it's interesting, if they think they're the master race, how are they making these mistakes? Maybe they need more influence from Christianity. Anyway, he says, the greatness of the one will depend on the absolute truth of his idea. These people, they make no sense. Considered in the abstract, whereas that of the other will depend on whether or not he correctly judges the given realities and how they may be utilized under the guidance of the truths established by the former. The test of greatness as applied to a political leader is the success of his plans and his enterprises, which means his ability to reach the goal for which he sets out, whereas the final goal set up by the political philosopher can never be reached, for human thought may grasp truths and picture ends, which it sees like clear crystal, though such ends can never be completely fulfilled because human nature is weak and imperfect. You see how, even in his own expression, he has a need for Christianity, but he keeps fighting it and fighting against it and claiming he doesn't need it. He continues, the more an idea is correct in the abstract, and therefore all the more powerful, the smaller is the possibility of putting it into practice, at least as far as this latter depends on human beings. The significance of a political philosopher does not depend on the practical success of the plans he lays down, but rather on their absolute truth and the influence they exert on the progress of mankind. If it were otherwise, the founders of religions could not be considered as the greatest men who have ever lived, because their moral aims will never be completely or even approximately carried out into practice. Well, this man needs to read Hebrews, because it tells them that they were very conscious that they weren't going to physically partake in these things. They knew that there was an age to come that was spiritual, and that's what they were fighting for. People who apparently aren't the master race, they want to claim, Hitler wants to claim he's the master race, but he can't grasp these things because you can't grasp them in flesh. He continues on page 177 on the 19-minute mark. Even that religion, which is called the religion of love, he's being a passive-aggressive woman here and referring to Christianity. He says, even that religion which is called the religion of love is really no more than a faint reflex of the will of its sublime founder. But its significance lies in the orientation which it endeavored to give to human civilization and human virtue and morals. He's giving all glory to flesh instead of Elohim. That's why he fails. But he brings a large train of wicked people behind him, so it delusions him into thinking he's right. That's in the Psalms. Read Psalm 73. It says there, loftily they threaten oppression. They set their faces towards the heavens, and their tongue struts through the earth. Therefore, many multitudes follow them and claim there's no fault, just like with Hitler and just like with Trump. So he continues, this very wide difference between the functions of a political philosopher and a practical political leader is the reason why the qualifications necessary for both functions are scarcely ever found associated in the same person. This applies especially to the so-called successful politician of the smaller kind, whose activity is indeed hardly more than practicing the art of doing the possible. As Bismarck modestly defined the art of politics in general. Remember the art of the deal? And when I said, go back and watch that art of the deal. I did. I think it was only 2 parts. It's deal, to invoke L. He continues, if such a politician resolutely avoids great ideas, his success will be all the easier to attain. It will be attained more expediently and frequently, will be more tangible. By reason of this very fact, however, such success is doomed to futility and sometimes does not even survive the death of its author. Generally speaking, the work of politicians is without significance for the following generation, because their temporary success was based on the expediency of avoiding all really great decisive problems and ideas which would be valid also for future generations. So something I noticed the other day, Trump's first vice president, Mike Pence, which literally means he's like a face and an outstretched hand. So he's just a spokesman. He does nothing. He gets no-name people to just be spokesman, and that's it, because it's all about him in his mind. In his own mind, he becomes great. So it was Trump Pence. It sounds like trumpet, like trumpence. Instead of repentance, you have trumpence. And it's TP. That's the Tav and the Peh. So it's the signature mark of the mouth. And also TPing a house. It's kind of a little wordplay there that they stole from the Hebrews. And now it's Trump Vance. So it's like advance, but Trump Vance. And it's TV now. And remember how I said Telavashen or Telayashen? It's to heap up or pile on to ruin. Sleep is Telayashen, and Telavashen is to heap up layer by layer and hook into the tabernacle and sharpen. But there's a false tabernacle. There's a true tabernacle and there's a false tabernacle. There's a true Mashiach and there's an anti-Mashiach. So TV would be Tav and Vav. Now that's the mark in the signature, and a Vav is specifically a curtain hook of the curtains of the tabernacle. So at first it was the mark of the mouth. Now it's the mark that hooks you into his tabernacle. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, says the Wizard of Oz. So he continues here. To pursue ideals which will still be of value and significance for the future is generally not very profitable undertaking, and he who follows such a course... Wait, let me read that again. To pursue ideals which will still be of value and significance for the future is generally not a very profitable undertaking, and he who follows such a course is only very rarely understood by the mass of the people, who find beer and milk a more persuasive index of political values than far-sighted plans for the future, the realization of which can only take place later on and the advantages of which can be reaped only by posterity. Yeah. So he's trying to say that people go more for materialism than than the spirit, which is true. But he's trying to say, if I just do it right, then me, I can be the great one. I can do it. It's like, oh, come on. Let's see. He continues, because of a certain vanity, which is always one of the blood relations of unintelligence, the general run of politicians will always eschew those schemes for the future which are really difficult to put into practice. And they will practice this avoidance so that they may not lose the immediate favor of the mob. The importance and the success of such politicians belong exclusively to the present and will be of no consequence for the future. But that does not worry small-minded people. They are quite content with momentary results. The position of the constructive political philosopher is quite different. The importance of his work must always be judged from the standpoint of the future, and he is frequently described by the word Weltfremd, or dreamer. Trump says this too. The dreamers. I'm doing it for the dreamers. While the ability of the politician, he says, consists in mastering the art of the possible, or the ideal, the founder of a political system belongs to those who are said to please the gods only because they wish for and demand the impossible. Interesting, he makes it plural. They will always have to renounce contemporary fame, but if their ideas be immortal, posterity will grant them its acknowledgement. Within long spans of human progress, it may occasionally happen that the practical politician and political philosopher are one. The more intimate this union is, the greater will be the obstacles which the activity of the politician will have to encounter. This is now page 178 at the 28-minute mark. Such a man does not labor for the purpose of satisfying demands that are obvious to every Philistine. Isn't that interesting he uses that word? This is probably like the second or third time I've heard that. He says, but he reaches out towards ends which can be understood only by the few. His life is torn asunder by hatred and love. The protest of his contemporaries who do not understand the man is in conflict with the recognition of posterity, for whom he also works. So remember, they would call Christians atheists or nihilists or irreligious because they wouldn't burn incense to Kaiser's statue. I mean, who really wants to? Except people who are under fear. But they would call Hebrews Philistines. They called the Hebrews who are already in the land that is now called Israel. They were already people of the dispersion coming to Israel. That's why they had the transfer agreement to force a bunch of people who they don't even know whether they're truly Hebrew or not, because the ones who desire to go there themselves are usually the true ones. If they're forced there on cattle trucks by Remfan, then you're going to get a lot of false ones that will do whatever the government says and annihilate whoever the government tells them to. And they won't care if that government looks less Semitic than them. They don't want to think for themselves. So he continues here. For the greater the work which a man does for the future, the less will he be appreciated by his contemporaries. His struggle will accordingly be all the more severe, and his success all the rarer. When in the course of centuries such a man appears who is blessed with success, then towards the end of his days he may have a faint prevision of his future fame. But such great men are only the marathon runners of history. The laurels of contemporary fame are only for the brow of the dying hero. Interesting. He wants to express all these things that seem to align with Christianity while denying it. So it has the appearance of godliness, but denies its power, because it just says fate and destiny and all that, right? It's very interesting. He continues, the great protagonists are those who fight for their ideas and ideals despite the fact that they receive no recognition at the hands of their contemporaries. They are the men whose memories will be enshrined in the hearts of the future generations. It seems then as if each individual felt it his duty to make retroactive atonement for the wrong which great men have suffered at the hands of their contemporaries. Their lives and their work are then studied with touching and grateful admiration. Especially in dark days of distress, such men have the power of healing broken hearts and elevating the despairing spirit of a people. See how the Antichrist doesn't necessarily mean the exact total opposite. It means the replacement of. So he's trying to replace a man like that and pretend to be a man like that when he's not, because he gives no glory to Elohim or Ben Elohim or even Ruach HaKodesh, which is the Holy Spirit. He continues, to this group belong not only the genuinely great statesmen, but all the great reformers as well. Besides Frederick the Great, go look him up. He was an Enlightenment guy. He was literally a Babylonian. Look up the part in Isaiah where he says, fallen are you, O Hallel. Sounds like halal, isn't that something? O shining one, son of dawn, who said he will be just like El and sit above the assembly of the heavens and speak and proclaim. It says he says this in his heart, but he's brought down to the utter depths of Sheol. And allegedly, Hitler took a cyanide pill and allegedly put a weapon to his head. And I won't say it because, you know, they try to mess with videos when you mention certain things. And they gave him a Viking funeral, except in the ground. They actually made an offering to a Catholic cult. I don't want to get into that. So he continues, this group belong... Oh yeah, so besides Frederick the Great, we have such men as Martin Luther and Richard Wagner. Martin Luther was like a pre-Jesuit. He claimed he spoke to the devil and saw him and threw things at him. I'm like, look, something's up. I don't know exactly who that man was, but you have to make your own decisions, because he has, if you read all the different things said about him, it's very interesting. But there's something odd about him and how they draw him. Whenever they draw pictures of him, there's something odd about him. So he continues here. When I heard Gottfried Feder's first lecture on the abolition of the interest servitude, I understood immediately that here was a truth of transcendental importance for the future of the German people. The absolute separation of stock exchange capital from the economic life of the nation would make it possible to oppose the process of internationalization in German business without at the same time attacking capital as such, for to do this would jeopardize the foundations of our national independence. I clearly saw what was developing in Germany, and I realized then that the stiffest fight we would have to wage would not be against the enemy nations, but against international capital. In Feder's speech, I found an effective rallying cry for our coming struggle. You see how if Prescott Bush and Rockefeller funded Hitler, Time magazine named him Man of the Year, 1933, Illuminati confirmed, then you could very easily, if you know his plan and read his book, you can cheat the stock system. When they firebombed Dresden, one woman's testimony is that in all the horror that she saw, a man came out holding a briefcase full of money because he had just come from the bank, and he like was laughing and said, "We knew this was going to happen." And he was saying something like, "We knew this was going to happen," and he's stealing all this money, and her testimony is that she thought she had saw the devil himself when she saw this man in the flames, and he was laughing while she's literally watching her people melt into the cement. So Mr. Hittite continues here. Here again, later events proved how correct was the impression we then had. The fools among our bourgeois politicians do not mock at us on this point any more, for even those politicians now see, if they would speak the truth, that international stock exchange capital was not only the chief instigating factor in bringing on the war, but that now when the war is over, it turns the peace into a hell. Very interesting. Yes, there's a lot of interviews from, I think, the 80s, 70s, 80s, of a lot of these men and women in World War II that saw a lot of things and heard a lot of things. And that was one of them. She had to run into the woods. She ran far away, and she went up on a hill, and she turned around. And she clenched her chest and wept for her city, because she saw her entire city she grew up in flames. And it was a very beautiful city. If you looked at Dresden, it was like the height of architecture and everything, and a bunch of Soviets came in and stole a bunch of very expensive paintings and this and that. You have to read history to know about that. So this is now page 179 on the 38-minute mark. Mr. Hittite continues, the struggle against international finance capital and loan capital has become one of the most important points in the program on which the German nation has based its fight for economic freedom and independence. Regarding the objections raised by so-called practical people, the following answer must suffice. He says, all apprehensions concerning the fearful economic consequences that would follow the abolition of the servitude that results from interest capital are ill-timed, for in the first place, the economic principles hitherto followed have proved quite fatal to the interest of the German people. The attitude adopted when the question of maintaining our national existence arose vividly recalls similar advice once given by experts. The Bavarian Medical College, for example, on the question of introducing railroads, the fears expressed by that august body of experts were not realized. Those who traveled in the coaches of the new steam horse, he says, did not suffer from vertigo. Those who looked on did not become ill, and the hoardings which had been erected to conceal the new invention were eventually taken down. Only those blinds which obscure the vision of the would-be experts have remained, and that will be always so. In the second place, the following must be borne in mind. He says, any idea may be a source of danger if it be looked upon as an end in itself, when really it is only the means to an end. For me, and for all genuine National Socialists, there is only one doctrine, people and fatherland. See, that's too vague, because the people were never heterogeneous in America or Germany, except maybe in America when Native Americans were there. They were a lot more heterogeneous than America is now, or Germany ever was. So, what is fatherland? People in Germany throughout history, they all had different fatherlands. They were all different tribes, and they functioned sort of like how what they call the Greeks, which is a false name, but for the sake of people understanding, I have to call them Greek. There were many, many tribes and many, many clans trying to work together for a stable government. And so they were surrounded by eagles like Macedon and vultures like Rome. Germanic people were the same. There were various tribes, and they were watched by an eagle called the supposed Holy Roman Emperors, and surrounded by vultures like the British and Spain. And these are crowns, not people I'm talking about. Crowns. These people who rule them aren't even of the same people. It's the same thing of the pharaohs in Egypt. The Egyptians and the pharaohs weren't the same people. I won't get into that. Waste time. I've said it a million times. Mr. Hittite continues, what we have to fight for is the necessary security for the existence and increase of our race and people. Again, just identity politics, because he's lying. The subsistence of its children and the maintenance of our racial stock unmixed. Again, there has never been a heterogeneous Germany. He's just lying. The freedom and independence of the fatherland, so that our people may be enabled to fulfill the mission assigned to it by the Creator. What's his name? Oh, the Creator. It's very vague. Just like these supposed conspiracy channels and arguing about the shape of the earth. They're always saying the Creator. What Creator? What's his name? What are his qualities? Is there a book about him? They'll be very vague because they're liars. And then they'll call you co-creators. It's like, yeah, that's polytheism. No, thank you. So Mr. Hittite continues, all ideas and ideals, all teaching and all knowledge must serve these ends. It is from this standpoint that everything must be examined and turned to practical uses or else discarded. Thus, a theory can never become a mere dead dogma, since everything will have to serve the practical ends of every day. Thus, the judgment arrived by Gottfried Feder determined me to make a fundamental study of a question with which I had hitherto not been very familiar. I began to study again, and thus it was that I first came to understand perfectly, in his words, what was the substance and purpose of the life work of the J. Karl Marx. And see, he wants to throw these words around. Jew is just supposed to be short for Yehuda. Yehuda means praisers, specifically praisers of Yahovah. So if Karl Marx doesn't go by the Torah or the preaching of Mashiach, which fulfills the Torah, then he is not a Yehudim. He's part of the congregation, or literally community center of Satan, the community center of accusers, which this man never ceases to accuse in his book. So, who are the real community center of Hashatan? So Mr. Hittite continues, his capital became intelligible to me now for the first time. And in the light of it, so he's saying enlightenment, he's doing the Babylonian thing, here we go. And in the light of it, I now exactly understood the fight of the Social Democrats against national economics. Remember, Social Democrat is his hobo code for Christians. He continues, a fight which was to prepare the ground for the hegemony of a real international and stock exchange capital. In another direction, also, this course of lectures had important consequences for me. It's now page 180 at the 45-minute mark. Ooh, might get interesting here. Mr. Hittite says, "One day I put my name down as wishing to take part in the discussion. Another of the participants thought that he would break a lance for the jays and entered into a lengthy defense of them." He'll never probably say what the guy said, and I don't know who he's actually defending. But he continues, "This aroused my opposition. An overwhelming number of those who attended the lecture course supported my views. The consequence of it all was that a few days later I was assigned to a regiment then stationed at Munich and given a position there as instruction officer." At that time, the spirit of discipline, what is it? You see how vague he is? Just like Trump, he has to say he never asked God for forgiveness because that's a judicial question, and he has to answer it that way because he's the son of perdition. Son of perdition never asked for forgiveness. So Hitler does the same thing. He has to say certain legal words because he doesn't want spiritual strings. You understand? So he continues, "At that time, the spirit of discipline, whenever that is, was rather weak among those troops. It was still suffering from the after effects of the period when the soldiers' councils were in control. Only gradually and carefully would a new spirit of military discipline and obedience be introduced in place of voluntary obedience, a term which had been used to express the ideal of military discipline under Kurt Eisner's higgledy-piggledy regime. The soldiers had to be taught to think and feel in a national and patriotic way. In these two directions lay my future line of action." So he's trying to say that he's trying to downplay voluntary obedience, which is what Scripture puts on a pedestal. Voluntary obedience. And he's trying to imply, I'm hearing, at least from what I'm hearing, that they should be forced to go to war. So Trump, Mr. Heel Spurs, getting him out of Vietnam, will probably make military service mandatory, of which I will deny it until I'm martyred. I will see his face, and he will see mine. In this world, he will hear my voice, and I will hear his. In this age, but not the next. Mr. Hittite continues, "I took up my work with the greatest delight and devotion. Here I was presented with an opportunity of speaking before quite a large audience. I was now able to confirm what I had hitherto merely felt, namely that I had a talent for public speaking. My voice had become so much better that I could be well understood, at least in all parts of the small hall where the soldiers assembled. No task could have been more pleasing to me than this one, for now, before being demobilized, I was in a position to render useful service to an institution which had been infinitely dear to my heart, namely the Army." So he's giving an infinitely dear label on Army, the ones that take life. Now remember, there are righteous armies and there are unrighteous armies, but we won't get into that. Because a lot of times the lines are very blurred. So Mr. Hittite continues, "I'm able to state that my talks were successful. During the course of my lectures, I have led back hundreds and even thousands of my fellow countrymen to their people and their fatherland. I nationalized these troops. By so doing, I helped to restore general discipline." Remember, when I do the quotations, they're in the book. Just to let you know what's quotation. He says, "Here again I made the acquaintance of several comrades whose thought ran along the same lines as my own and who later became members of the first group out of which the new movement developed." So he's gathering his anti-disciples. So now it's going into chapter 9, the German Labor Party, at the end of page 180. I'll read this real quick here. One day I received an order from my superiors to investigate the nature of an association which was apparently political. It called itself the German Labor Party and was soon to hold a meeting at which Gottfried Feder would speak. I was ordered to attend this meeting and report on the situation. He's a little spy. This is now page 181 on the 51-minute mark here. The spirit of curiosity in which the army authorities then regarded political parties. Spirit of curiosity in which the army authorities then regarded political parties can be very well understood. The revolution had granted the soldiers the right to take an active part in politics, and it was particularly those with the smallest experience who had availed themselves of this right. But not until the Center and the Social Democratic parties were reluctantly forced to recognize that the sympathies of the soldiers had turned away from the revolutionary parties towards the national movement and the national reawakening, they feel obliged to withdraw from the army the right to vote, to forbid it all political activity. This is just to foment violence from people who have already experienced violence. You see how they do that? It's by design. So, he then states, the fact that the Center and Marxism had adopted this policy was instructive, because if they had not thus curtailed the rights of the citizen, as they described the political rights of the soldiers after the revolution, the government, which had been established in November 1918, would have been overthrown within a few years, and the dishonor and disgrace of the nation would not have been further prolonged. At that time, the soldiers were on the point of taking the best way to rid the nation of the vampires and valets who served the cause of the Entente in the interior of the country. It's interesting he uses the word vampire because Vlad the Impaler. Anyway, but the fact that the so-called national parties voted enthusiastically for right when I say enthusiastically for the doctrinaire policy of the criminals who organized the revolution in November 1918 helped also to render the army inefficient as an instrument of national restoration, and thus showed once again where men might be led by the purely abstract notions accepted by these most gullible people. The minds of the bourgeois middle classes had become so fossilized, boomerism, that they I added boomerism, obviously. They become so fossilized that they sincerely believed the army could once again become what it had previously been, namely a rampart of German valor. While the Center Party and the Marxists intended only to extract the poisonous tooth of nationalism, without which an army must always remain just a police force, but can never be in the position of a military organization capable of fighting against the outside enemy. This truth was sufficiently proved by subsequent events. Remember, they do this to every country, systematically, until there's no men left. It's historical. You can just, if you read history. He continues, or did our national politicians believe, after all, that development of our army could be other than national? This belief might be possible and could be explained by the fact that during the war they were not soldiers but merely talkers. In other words, they were parliamentarians, and as such they did not have the slightest idea of what was passing in the hearts of those men who remembered the greatness of their own past and also remembered that they had once been the first soldiers in the world. I decided to attend the meeting of this party, which had hitherto been entirely unknown to me. When I arrived that evening in the guest room of the former Sternecker Brewery, which had now become a place of historical significance for us, I found approximately 20 to 25 persons present, most of them belonging to the lower classes. I'll finish this page too, I guess. It's at the 55-minute mark, page 182. Mr. Hittite says, the theme of Fetter's lecture was already familiar to me, for I had heard it in the lecture course I have spoken of. Therefore, I could concentrate my attention on studying the society itself. The impression it made upon me was neither good nor bad. I felt that here was just another one of these many new societies which were being formed at that time. It's compartmentalization. In those days, everybody felt called upon to found a new party, like Reaganism or Trumpism. It's always the same thing. Found a new party whenever he felt displeased with the course of events and had lost confidence in all the parties are existing. That's in the song, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Thus it was, says Mr. Hittite, that new associations sprouted up all around to disappear just as quickly without exercising any effect or making any noise whatsoever. Generally speaking, the founders of such associations did not have the slightest idea of what it means to bring together a number of people for the foundations of a party or a movement. Therefore, these associations disappeared because of their woeful lack of anything like an adequate grasp of the necessities of the situation. My opinion, says Mr. Hittite, of the German Labor Party was not very different after I had listened to their proceedings for about 2 hours. I was glad when Fetter finally came to a close. I had observed enough and was just about to leave when it was announced that anybody who wished was free to open a discussion. Thereupon, I decided to remain, but the discussion seemed to proceed without anything of vital importance being mentioned, when suddenly a professor commenced to speak. I don't know why he puts some of these words in quotations, but anyway. He opened, I wonder if it's like a code, if you read all the, but I ain't getting into that. So he said, when suddenly a professor commenced to speak. He opened by throwing doubt on the accuracy of what Fetter had said, and then, after Fetter had replied very effectively, the professor suddenly took up his position on what he called the basis of facts. But before this, he recommended the young party most urgently to introduce the succession of Bavaria from Prussia as one of the leading proposals in its program. In the most self-assured way, this man kept on insisting that German Austria would join Bavaria, and that the peace would then function much better. He made other similarly extravagant statements. At this juncture, I felt bound to ask for permission to speak and to tell the learned gentleman what I thought. The result was that the honorable gentleman who had last spoken slipped out of his place like a whipped cur without uttering a sound. While I was speaking, the audience listened with an expression of surprise on their faces. When I was just about to say good night to the assembly and leave, a man came after me quickly and introduced himself. I had not grasped the name correctly, but he placed a little book in my hand, which was obviously a political pamphlet, and asked me very earnestly to read it. Yeah, this is how they control their MKUltra subjects. They give them books and reading material. And it's like, I listen to Solomon. So many, many books is vanity. So I read scripture, or I expose a book if I'm going to read it. So he continues, I was quite pleased because in this way I could come to know about his association without having to attend its tiresome meetings. Moreover, this man, who had the appearance of a workman, made a good impression on me. Thereupon, I left the hall. Interesting. Yeah, the appearance of a workman. Yeah, a lot of masons do. Because they work. They move heavy equipment, or they work in construction, or they're stone masons. And when they climb up the ladder, they become Pera masons. They become pharaohs, free masons. That's where you get the word free from, is pharaoh. So that is the 1 hour mark here. So I'm going to play some music. And start the next one maybe at like 1:20. Take a little break, maybe walk around, I don't know.
Wait a minute, are you knocking this country? Are you saying something against America?
Against it? I should be positively astounded to hear of anything that be said for it. Why, the whole bloody place is the most unspeakable matriarchy in the whole history of civilization. Look at yourself and the way your wife and her strumpet of a mother push you through the hoop.